Welcome to the summer edition of the Sprint to Success with Design Thinking podcast.
How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin, and how do you develop the mindset and skill set to be successful? Welcome, everyone, to the Sprint to Success with Design Thinking podcast. I'm your host, Saba Kidwai. Join me each week as I share the stories and strategies from the world's leading researchers and practitioners about why they believe the answer lies in practicing design thinking.
One of the challenges with that is it's hard to measure the other things, right? It's easy to measure the reading, the math, and things like that. And I think it's not so much that people shouldn't be measuring that. I think, yeah, sure, we should know to help guide however it is we move forward. But I think where I think a lot of people are struggling with the approach is it's very narrow. So the approach isn't sort of holistic in that yes, we're going to do this and we're going to do X, Y, Z. So the and part is kind of left up sort of to individuals, right? Individual districts, individual schools and whatnot that may want to take that on. But what we know from past data and past research and just the past decades of the inequities that we've seen is that the people that will need that and something more approach more are most likely not going to get it. And so I think that's where sort of the challenge lies. We've been doing lately on Clubhouse a series of discussions with just Gen Z students, and high school students, middle school students, just kind of asking them, what are some of the things you feel you need moving forward? And I would say the overwhelming response has been mental health and relationships. We want people to ask us if we're okay. We want to have the time and space to talk about those types of things. And so, actually Yang Zhao wrote a really, really brilliant article talking about sort of this, either what happens when you do an either or approach and how we need to do sort of take more of a yes and approach to this. And so he's saying it's not that the standardized testing is awful or that we shouldn't be doing it at all. It's totally understandable that we want to understand more about learning loss and just these types of things. But standardized testing alone is just so narrow in what it's going to be able to tell us that he says we miss things well, what about the confidence and resilience that kids have gained during this time? What about perhaps some of their more entrepreneurial, personality traits that may have come up as they were having to figure things out? Or, what about the creativity that many of them, or the self-regulation, their decision-making skills, their self-management skills, their self-awareness skills? What about all these other sort of elements that, and when you mentioned earlier, social emotional learning, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, I think that's what their acronym is. They're kind of the go-to resource, right? And so if you look at their 5 elements that make up social emotional learning, those are the very qualities, right? Self-awareness, self-regulation, decision-making skills, social awareness. And that's really probably where our kids have probably gained so much in. Yet I think the challenge for us is how do we create now that environment, the time and space for them to actually reflect on that? Because I think many of them have not been, right? Unless you've been, fortunate enough to perhaps have a teacher or a parent or somebody who has guided you in that way. And so I think that's really where the challenge is. I think they've probably learned way more. I think we've all, even as adults, we've learned way more. But I'd say even as adults, how many of us have taken the time to pause and reflect and actually give ourselves that time and space. And so I think for kids, that's going to be so important. Going back to that Hong Kong example, right? If you help them unpack that at that level, you're likely to see better outcomes when it comes to the reading, the math, and all the other types of things. But without that baseline, without the understanding of the social awareness, the social emotional stuff and whatnot, I think it becomes harder then to be able to, I guess, find your place, I think, in a world that's changing so much. I read a really brilliant book. I was actually pretty close to the start of the pandemic, I think, called Life is in the Transitions. And he talked so much about this idea that, that we all know to be true, yet we just, don't really seem to acknowledge that much, that life is not linear anymore. Nothing about the world that we live in is linear anymore. Oh, I'm going to go to school, get a job and get married and work for 40 years and retire in the home that I bought. Just it doesn't happen anymore. You know what I mean? It definitely doesn't happen for this next generation because there's just so many more options about what we could do, where we could go. Sure, I might graduate high school, but maybe I want to take a gap year. Maybe I want to do something else. Maybe I want to travel for a few years. Maybe I'm going to go to college for a year. Maybe I decide to start my own company. Like we're zigzagging, and that's the beauty of the world, but it's also like a challenge if you're not prepared to navigate sort of like that zigzagging and you don't have that skill set. So he does a really great job in talking about like the importance of reflecting on your own life story and how you see yourself plays a significant role in your confidence in like this zigzagging of life that we have to do now. So like, I feel like I wish that was a book that like, we read with like students. So like it's really, really, really brilliant. And it did a great job of kind of setting some of that context.
It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you still have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Sprint to Success with Design Thinking community.